Hello and welcome to episode 63 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh Hawes, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
I'm Christine Van Gyn, the CCF's litigation director.
And I'm Joanna Barron, executive director of the CCF.
In today's episode, I'm going to tell you about a case challenging Canada's voting system, pretty topical the day after the US election.
I'll discuss a letter from about a dozen Ontario mayors who are calling on the Ontario Premier Doug Ford to use the Notwithstanding clause after judges blocked the clearing of homeless encampments.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to tell you about a BC court injunction that blocked a woman's planned medically assisted death. And I know we just talked about MAID, but this is such a big development in the law that our listeners will probably want to hear about it. The case is called AY and NB, and it involves a doctor named Ellen Wiebe, who is somewhat famous in Vancouver, not only as an outspoken abortion provider, but also as a pioneer of MAID, which now makes up about half of her practice. And just a warning to listeners, this is a pretty sad case, so I won't blame you if you want to skip ahead a little bit to something lighter. Here's what happened. So AY sought an injunction to prevent in-law partner NB from going through with her planned medically assisted death from Dr. Wiebe. And the injunction was granted at the 11th hour, like literally the same day that this was scheduled to take place. The test for an injunction is showing that there's a serious case to be tried, that there would be irreparable harm if the injunction isn't granted, and that what's called the balance of convenience favors the applicant. In this case, the boyfriend had the balance of convenience because he could show that he would be more inconvenienced if his girlfriend died than she would be inconvenienced if she was denied MAID and then had to, wait to go ahead with it later. So this injunction was brought without notice to either the doctor or the patient. So we really have one side of the story. And what I'm going to tell you about the facts is it's basically a condensed version of what was written by the judge, Justice Koval. So AY and NB live in Alberta, and they've lived together since 2011. NB is a 53-year-old professional who was diagnosed with bipolar 2. And in the summer of 2023, NB went through an intense manic phase that led her to take a drug that she decided to taper off too quickly. And she described feeling horrors in the sense of terrors and nightmares. She couldn't sleep. She had suicidal thoughts. And she diagnosed herself with a condition called akathisia. So she said she wanted to die, and she begged her husband to help her do so. And she attended 10 counseling sessions with a counselor named Mr. Hall, who had akathisia himself. NB's friend, Ms. M, attended these sessions with her and deposed to the court that Mr. Hall told them akathisia was treatable and that people did get through it. On March 18th, 2024, NB and Ms. M also attended a video consultation with a doctor named Mark Horowitz, and Ms. M's evidence was that Dr. Horowitz also said that, people can heal from akathisia. AY's evidence was that NB's own doctors in Alberta would not approve MAID, so she began to expand her search, and that's how she came across Dr. Wiebe online in mid-July. To AY's understanding, NB had at least 2 video calls with Dr. Wiebe, and Dr. Wiebe approved her for MAID at the end of the first call. His evidence is that Dr. Wiebe did not speak directly with NB's doctors, though NB did provide some of her medical records. And AY saw NB's MAID form, which she submitted on August 30th, 2024, and it said akathisia was the reason for seeking MAID. Because NB couldn't get anyone she knew to witness the form, a volunteer from Dr. Wiebe's clinic witnessed it for her. And AY's evidence is that because NB didn't have a second doctor to provide the legally required second MAID assessment, Dr. Wiebe arranged that too. In October 2024, NB had another online appointment with Dr. Wiebe, which AY attended, and he said that I attended that meeting as I'm concerned that akathisia is not an irremediable condition. I asked Dr. Wiebe if she had ever carried out MAID on someone with akathisia. Dr. Wiebe said that she had not. During that same Zoom session, I also attempted to describe her as a person with unresolved mental health problems, which were probably not considered during the MAID assessment, and Dr. Wiebe responded by saying that diagnosis does not matter and only quality of life matters, and that it was her right. So AY and Ms. M arranged for an emergency consultation with Dr. Horowitz on October 17th. AY's evidence about Dr. Horowitz's advice was this. He reiterated his view that she might recover from her akathisia. He again told her to pause her medication, tapering, and let her body adjust. He said akathisia might go away in a matter of months, probably 2 to 4 months. Then, if she followed his advice, she could wean off of the drug. And Ms. M gave similar evidence. So AY told the court that he sought this injunction because, among other things, he thought NB is in immediate danger, and neither he nor NB's friends wanted her to die. He believed her condition is treatable, and he was concerned that if he gave notice of the application, that NB might bring forward her appointment with the doctor. So the judge noted that he had received a lengthy letter from Mr. Hall, who saw NB over 10 video sessions, and stated that though he's not, and Mr. Hall stated that though he's not opposed to MAID in principle, there are many, many people who have similarly faced medication adverse effects and withdrawal and then recovered, and they were grateful that they didn't end their lives. So those are the facts according to the judge. He then reviewed the law, including the criminal code sections that exempt doctors who do MAID from what would otherwise be homicide, which requires, among other things, that the patient have a grievous and irremediable medical condition and that they have given informed consent to receive MAID after having been informed that means are available to relieve their suffering, including palliative care. And unsurprisingly, the judge found there was a serious question to be tried, including whether the condition really was irremediable. And the irreparable harm was fairly obvious. The judge wrote that he recognizes that the injunction is a severe intrusion into NB's personal and medical autonomy, and he can only imagine the pain that she has been experiencing, and that this injunction will likely only make that pain worse. But he added, given his conclusions, that there's an arguable case about whether or not the MAID criterion process were properly applied, the interests of justice require that this interim injunction be granted. So that's the decision. Very sad. NB can appeal, but if she doesn't, the case will likely go ahead. And I don't want to get too much into this, but I would note that the National Post did a really long feature article about Dr. Wiebe in the summer that we'll link to. And it's a must read because it gives an unusual amount of insight into what the MAID process actually looks like. Despite supporting MAID in principle, reading this article really gave me the chills. The article also considers the joy and self-fulfillment that doctors, including Dr. Wiebe, who provide MAID, often express, and contrast that with the sad and angry feelings that family members of those who die of MAID often express. For example, there's a guy in the article named Christopher Lyons whose father received MAID at the age of 77 after bouts of depression. And he's quoted in the article saying, "What happens to a person when they're killing becomes a daily or weekly event." And he points out that some MAID providers have counts in the hundreds and says this isn't normal for any occupation. Even members of the military at war do not kill that frequently. So really intense article, really sad story. Joanna, I know you read this article too. You said something in it made you think we need spaces, not only for those who want to receive MAID, but also for those who want a space where MAID is not happening. Did you want to tell us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it really hit home because the article details that Dr. Wiebe performed MAID on an elderly Jewish man in his retirement home. And this was, to be clear, the family's wishes. But it turns out that the delivery of MAID is quite regulated, and you can't just go in wherever there's even a voluntarily, perhaps terminally ill, I don't know if this fellow was terminally ill or not, individual and deliver MAID. That's just, it's cordoned off to specified spaces. And it really hit home because my grandmother, who's 96 years old and thriving, we finally decided as a family it was the best thing for her to move into a retirement home. And she moved into a predominantly Jewish retirement home in Forest Hill, Toronto. And it's probably about 95% Jewish. And this week I was there because they were having a Holocaust education week where a lot of the residents who are survivors were talking about their experience. It's the last cohort of survivors, so it's weighty. And I just thought about how these individuals who saw people being, put to death and subjected to medical experiments and killed by the state in all kinds of horrifying ways, how they would feel if they knew that an individual was receiving euthanasia right next door to them. And it seems to me really degrading to their dignity, no matter what they or we might think about the moral rightfulness of euthanasia. And that's not even to get into people who have very clear and explicit religious prohibitions against medically assisted death, which most Jewish people do not. And so it was really upsetting for me to read not just that this happened, but that Dr. Wiebe was, I believe, a complaint was made to her regulator, but she was not sanctioned for it. And you think about, sorry to go there, but Jordan Peterson getting sanctioned for nasty tweets about how hot a plus size swimsuit model was, and this person just blatantly disregarding the regulations surrounding MAID and nothing happening to her. So there's something just deeply creepy about this. There's something deeply creepy about someone who's convinced themselves to relish in helping to kill people. And I agree, it really shows a part of the culture around MAID that I hadn't previously been privy to, thank God. And it completely has made me reconsider sort of the moral valence of medically assisted death. Sorry, this is a heavy discussion, but I don't know, Christine, if you want to add anything or if we should move on.
I'll just say really briefly, I have outlined kind of my position on MAID in a YouTube video that I uploaded a couple of days ago, which please, if you listen to this, go and watch it on YouTube because it has been down pushed by the algorithm on YouTube. The video is called Euthanasia in Canada. And I sort of explain my position that I'm not a conscientious objector. I do understand why some people would choose to have MAID. And I think that the Carter decision from the Supreme Court back in, I don't even remember when it was like 2015. Is that when it was, Joanna? Do you remember?
Yep.
It was, yeah. So, I mean, when that decision came out.
No, it was, sorry, it was 2015. Yeah.
I just don't think like where we are right now is where we expected to be when the Carter decision came out. And we expected there to be guardrails in place that just don't seem to be there. And there's been some really disturbing reporting on cases like the ones that you described, Josh, and a number of other cases that I outline in that YouTube video that were reported on by the Associated Press. So if you want to hear more about what I think, check out that video. Also, it will help us because it's really being pushed down by the algorithm right now for some reason. So I'll turn now to talk about my news headline, which is about elections and voting. And it's not because of the US election, although I think all of us were up past our bedtimes, our usual early lame bedtimes, watching the vote come in the US yesterday. But our case, what I want to talk about is a case that we were involved in at the Court of Appeal of Ontario, and it was about the constitutionality of Canada's voting system. It was brought by two activist groups who oppose Canada's first past the post system. Those groups are called Fair Vote BC and Springtide. So I think probably most of our listeners know what the first past the post voting system is. It's the system that we inherited from Great Britain, where the winning candidate doesn't need to win a majority of votes. They just need to receive more votes than anyone else. And Springtide and Fair Vote BC don't like the system. They argue that it violates the charter guaranteed right to vote and the right to equality. Those are protected under sections 3 and 15 of the charter. And they say it violates Section 3, the voting rights, because citizens don't have equal voting power. The losing candidate votes are, they say, wasted. Your vote doesn't count if you voted for the losing candidate. And they also say under Section 15, the guarantee against discrimination, that the first past the post system discriminates against women and minorities by contributing to their underrepresentation. There's obviously some problems with this argument. I mean, if you want to prove that women and minorities are underrepresented, and that's the basis for finding the system is unconstitutional, there's basically no system, there's no voting system that will achieve the kind of substantive equality that these groups are demanding, even in their preferred system, which seems to be proportionate representation, that will not be achieved. That system will also be inadequate. And there are many factors that go into the underrepresentation of women and minorities among the political class. And the voting system is not even the leading cause. Like, there are much broader causes. But I think in this case, the bigger problem with the applicant's argument relates to constitutional interpretation. And that's what we were in court arguing about as an intervener. We argued that the first past the post voting system does not violate the Constitution. Indeed, it is part of Canada's Constitution insofar as parts of the Constitution Act 1867 make reference to this type of system. It's an entrenched feature in our Constitution and not subject to charter scrutiny. And it's a deeply integrated feature of Canada's democratic institutions and legal order. And it was during the 1982 patriation of the Constitution. And the first past the post system is subject to a strong presumption of continuity. And there's nothing in the text of the charter that rebuts the presumption of continuity. So we argued that the events of the 1982 charter, they did not revolutionize Canada's constitutional order. They were an evolution, not a revolution. With very few exceptions, patriation expressly preserved the historic foundations of that constitutional order. The adoption of the charter was, it was an important event. It was a turning point in our constitutional trajectory, but it was one that, as I said, was marked by evolution rather than revolution as a change to our constitutional order. And there's every indication that the provisions that the Constitution Act 1982 There's every indication in these provisions of the Constitution Act 1982 in general and the Charter in particular, there's every indication that they intended to build upon, not supplant or replace the existing legal order. We argued, citing some case law, that the Constitution is not an empty vessel to be filled with whatever meaning we might wish from time to time. Nor is its interpretation to be guided by some vague feel, spirit, or vibe. That's a Stratus quote from the Federal Court of Appeal. The interpretation of the Charter is constrained by the language, structure, and history of the constitutional text, by constitutional tradition, and by the history, traditions, and underlying philosophies of our society. In any voting system, some people will win, some parties will win, and some will lose. And activists who have lost in the current system, it seems like this case is about trying to advance the political change that they want through the courts. But the desire for political change is not to demand a restructuring of Canada's voting system based on false claims that the system that we have had since Confederation is suddenly unconstitutional. The solution for these groups is to advance better candidates or better ideas. It's not to demand the courts bring the change they wish to see. And I think that this is especially important to remember during this current political moment, when we sadly see election systems falsely called into question for political gain. And the system that we have in Canada, look, a lot of people have said this to me on Twitter. They don't like the first past the post system. We are not saying that that system is perfect, but it is perfectly constitutional. And it's open to Parliament to choose a different system, but it's not open for the courts to supplant the decision of Parliament with the activists' preferred system. So, Josh, any reaction to this claim that our system is suddenly unconstitutional?
It's pretty silly, to be honest, and I think you explained well all the problems with that. It's basically a political question, and everybody knows that because it was a huge issue in the 2015 in the 2015 election, and Trudeau promised this will be the last election with first past the post, and that got a lot of NDP voters on board. And then, oh wait, surprise, surprise, he did not fulfill that promise. But that could be something on the table in this particular minority parliament. If he wants continued support from the NDP, maybe he will make that change.
So, by the way, he said in an interview, Trudeau said in an interview recently with Nate Erskine-Smith that the reason he didn't do this change is because the proportionate representation list system would have the party choosing the candidates. So if you're concerned about minority or female representation, like you're putting that in the hands of the party to choose who they want. And if that party doesn't want to put forward women or minorities, like that, you still are left with the same problem of underrepresentation. It's just in someone else's hands instead of the people's hands who run the nominations at the grassroots level. Joanna, any reaction to that?
Not to that specifically. I would say, though, 2 weekends ago, I was in Dallas at this seminar where we're reading Plato, and just to like take it back to this original sort of knee-jerk reaction I have to people who try and do things like let's just force the courts to go back to a blank slate and imagine what electoral system would suit what we imagine to be our preferences and perfect equality. And Plato's Republic is basically, I think, a warning sign of what happens when people try and social engineer the quote unquote perfect state. There's all of these absurd outcomes, like you have to break apart the family so men and women can fight alongside each other and nobody has particular attachments to anyone else. You have to lie to everyone to say that one group of people deserves to rule over them. And basically, it's just a warning sign about being too precious about how we organize our politics. And to come around to this, the converse of that is that there is a wisdom to, and I'm going to sound like an old stodgy conservative, but there really is a wisdom to like embodied experience and history. And I just like, there's just like a fundamental dispositional, and I know that we're not talking about whether first past the post is the best. It probably isn't. But instinctually, I have a problem with somebody who's just like, the charter wiped the slate clean and everything is up for grabs. Like, that's just such a stupid, it's just so stupid. I'm very sorry. This is not a serious argument. And I'm glad that we intervened to, make the points about what constitutional interpretation is or it isn't. But these people are so wrongheaded.
Okay, let's take our break, and then I'm going to give you my bad legal take for the week. Oh, sorry, it's Joanna's headline. Okay, let's take our break, and then we're going to get to Joanna's headline.
Okay, so the debate over the Notwithstanding clause has been very polarizing. It has been somewhat of a permanent fixture in our legal and political discourse, I would say at least since 2018, when Premier Doug Ford revived it in the case that challenged the composition of Toronto City Council, and it continues on. And so recently there has been a controversial move coming from the mayors, the cavalry that is Ontario town mayors. Not big city mayors, small town mayors. We'll get into that. And that is sparking current debates about mental health, homelessness, and constitutional rights and what they extend to. So a group of 12 Ontario mayors led by Alex Nuttall, who is the mayor of Barrie, and Patrick Brown, good old trusty Patrick Brown, of course, the mayor of Brampton, have written to Doug Ford and urged him to use the Notwithstanding Clause, Section 33 of the Constitution, on the encampments that have been blooming in their cities ever since, especially the pandemic. Also, the mayors of Brantford, Chatham-Kent, Oshawa, St. Catharines, Cambridge, Pickering, and Clarington have signed on, and their goal is to give law enforcement more power to dismantle homeless encampments and enforce mandatory drug and mental health treatments. And this comes after a judge earlier this year, yes, it was earlier this year in Waterloo, issued a ruling determining that the city of Waterloo could not forcibly clear its encampments. And the judge of the Superior Court denied Waterloo's request and said that evicting individuals under that bylaw would violate a constitutional precedent set in BC in a few decisions that established a right for people to shelter themselves if accessible, publicly funded indoor spaces aren't available. Now, notably absent from this letter are the mayors of Toronto, Ottawa, and Mississauga. But the 12 mayors who have signed on are asking for several changes, including strengthening mandatory, involuntary mental health care systems, expanding addiction treatment, rewriting trespass laws that to include jail time for repeat offenders, banning open drug use, radical idea, similar to public alcohol consumption laws, and creating a court diversion system for rehabilitation. And this comes after Ford recently challenged mayors to show, quote unquote, backbone in addressing their homelessness issues. But it does reveal a divide amongst the mayors, with obviously the big city mayors reluctant to endorse, to go to resort to the use of the notwithstanding clause. And Mayor Burton of Oakville signed the letter, but he said that some of the Ontario mayors at a meeting last week were uncomfortable with the use of the notwithstanding clause. And he thought that they should basically buck up because it was wrong to ask for sweeping legislative changes to deal with the crisis, but not to endorse the use of Section 33 if necessary. And of course, as I mentioned at the top, Doug Ford has shown that he's not exactly shy about invoking the notwithstanding clause when he thinks it serves his interests. Some legal experts that we've discussed in the extensive debate over the notwithstanding clause say that it was meant to be rarely used, but the provinces, including Saskatchewan, Ontario, obviously Quebec has been doing this for a long time, have shown a really increasing willingness to deploy it when they think that they are going to collide with courts. Now, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association has come out strongly opposed to the proposals. They have said that forced treatment is akin to arbitrary detention, and that new trespass laws would effectively criminalize poverty. I have a lot of thoughts about this. My first thought is that notwithstanding the Waterloo decision, which I wrote about when it happened for the Hub, and I thought was a really bad decision, and effectively also embracing positive rights, which we talked about last week, this right to shelter. So if we leave aside that kind of zany decision, it's not clear to me that they need the notwithstanding clause to do things like banning open drug use and expanding addiction services. The issue of involuntary treatment is, of course, a completely separate matter, and it looks like you would need the notwithstanding clause to effectuate that, particularly given the Supreme Court of Canada's precedent on involuntary treatment in Swayze, where they say, yes, that is unconstitutional. And we'll see what happens in BC now that the NDP government has been elected. But I think this is more of a signaling exercise. The mayors are clearly signaling that they are in over their heads and they cannot just, quote unquote, show backbone. Doug Ford, this is something that they don't have the resources to deal with, and they need, a shot of adrenaline from the provincial government. Remember that this has been getting really, really bad for some time. Earlier this year, the city of Belleville even declared a state of emergency because there were so many overdoses in a 24-hour period. There were 17 overdoses in a 24-hour period that ambulances couldn't even get into the small downtown core. So I don't know how we balance public safety concerns with the rights of vulnerable populations. My gut is that Doug Ford is not going to go for this. But Josh, what do you think? You've written and researched a lot about encampments, and you also have strong views on the notwithstanding clause.
Yeah, I do have strong views on the notwithstanding clause, and the view is basically that, it's part of the Constitution and that occasionally it will be acceptable to use it when courts get things wrong. I still think it should be used pretty sparingly. This situation is an interesting one where it might make some sense, but I think people are also like greatly over. They're really misunderstanding how far some of these rulings go, because the right that's supposedly been identified, and it is really a positive right in disguise, is that the city can't and the police can't come and like remove your tent if that's the only thing sheltering you from the elements, because otherwise you're at risk of like death or serious bodily injury from the rain or the snow or the cold. But they can do that if there's enough shelter beds and they have a really obvious alternative for for you to do. That's what essentially what most of these rulings say. So that doesn't go as far as a lot of people think it is. Like people are saying that there's now this right to housing, that these decisions have found there's a right to housing. And in one sense, yes, but also no. So anyway, I think that we'll see what the legislation looks like. I don't think necessarily the provincial government's really thought through exactly how that's going to stop these encampments. Like in Toronto, they're clearing them, and I think it's good that they're clearing a lot of these because they're really dangerous and in places where people could no longer, access parks. But what you see is they pop up in other places, and they're not just going to go away, right? Because there's not enough shelter necessarily for people available. So yeah, we'll see what happens. We'll have to wait for the legislation. And
Yeah, it's obvious that just like, Olivia Chow is not going to sign on to something like this. The mayor of Mississauga is not going to sign on to it. They just like, we'll have the cops clear encampments, but just it would not accord with their wokeness and with their posturing to actually say and use the notwithstanding clause. What do you think, Christine?
I think if there's an alternative to using the notwithstanding clause, you should do that. It's obviously highly contentious to use the notwithstanding clause. So if there's a different way to solve the problem, like solve it that way, obviously that's a better option. I know you guys have not wanted me to bring this up, but
no, we want you to.
I just want to mention the amazing looking encampment that they found in Edmonton that was this crazy multi-story fort made out of wood and sticks, and it had running water and marble flooring and refrigeration in Edmonton. And if you haven't seen this, go and check the video out of it. I think the Edmonton police posted it, but it was completely amazing, like what they had built. They had power that they were using to power like a bike chop shop where they like took apart stolen bikes and had them done to resell them. So one of the other things I wanted to mention was I did an interview recently with a professor from Mount Royal University about the Alberta Bill of Rights. And so one of the things that's interesting about the Alberta Bill of Rights is it has its own version of the notwithstanding clause in it. And we talked about this in the last episode of the podcast, how it has this. And one thing that is interesting on the politics of the notwithstanding clause is a lot of conservatives, especially sort of federally, trumpet the usefulness of the notwithstanding clause. And they say, this is an important mechanism for when courts get things wrong in order for the supremacy of the people and through parliament to correct mistakes of the court when they've gone too far and rein in activist courts. But the conservatives in Alberta are extremely critical of the use of the inclusion of the notwithstanding clause in the Alberta Bill of Rights. So some inconsistency in the views on this type of legal mechanism on the right of center federally and provincially. It's just an interesting observation. I want to turn now to my bad legal take because there's construction in my neighborhood this week, so I'm about to lose power. So I need to get through this quickly, and I have a lot to say about this. So my bad legal take this week goes to Kim Murray. She's the independent special interlocutor for missing children at unmarked graves and burial sites. And Miss Murray did an investigation into the unmarked burial sites at residential schools. I think it took her 2 years, and she recently released her final report. And I will start by saying that there is no defense to me of residential schools as a policy that forcibly took children from their families. And we know that there were children who were forced, who were taken over their parents' objections. We know that there were children who were abused at residential schools. And we know that there were children who died and that some children went missing. One of the most well-known stories is a boy named Charlie Wenjack, he was an Anishinaabe boy who ran away from the residential school in Kenora, and he tried to walk 600 kilometers home. He died tragically of exposure and hunger. And some people try to make the argument that residential schools were well-intentioned because they taught children, how to read and write. They taught various skills. They ensured children had food. And some people make a spiritual argument as well about religious education being important. Like, I do not give a F. You take my child from my cold, dead hands. If you forcibly take my child from me, I do not care how noble you think your cause is. There is nothing worse than taking a child away from his mother who is saying no. And I just do not understand why some people on the right want to be apologists for this anti-family, big government policy of institutionalization. I think it's unforgivable to take a child from his mother over her objections. So Kim Murray, she investigated the residential schools and the unmarked burial sites, and she released her final report about residential schools as part of her, and part of her focus in this report was something she calls residential school denialism. So she traveled the country, meeting with people who had been sent to residential schools, collecting their stories. And I think that this is really important work. You know, she identified cases of residential school students who had been used for unethical research on malnutrition during the 1940s and 50s. That's terrible. You know, there were stories that she told of vitamin deficient children who were given diets and supplements to test whether they worked, all while the state underfunded the school's food budgets and restricted dental care. Like that, these are terrible stories. To the extent that there are people who want to minimize how terrible these kinds of things, how terrible residential schools were, like stories like that Kim Murray collected, that's an answer to denialism. But there were also a bunch of really bad legal proposals in her report. Like the stories are so important, but some of the proposed solutions are bad. So one thing she proposed is bringing the International Criminal Court in to investigate Canada and possibly prosecute government officials for enforced disappearances, what she calls enforced disappearances. And I mean, the ICC already declined an investigation in part for lack of jurisdiction because, you know, the residential school policy happened before Canada even ratified the relevant laws, which I think was the Rome Statute, which was ratified in 2000. I don't even know what government officials might still be alive to prosecute. She calls for the criminalization of residential school denialism, which itself is a really dubious concept. Like, what exactly would constitute denialism? And we shouldn't be criminalizing speech, even stupid and wrong speech. In the case of residential schools, there's still a lot of facts that are unknown. Like Murray herself has called for a 20-year investigation into residential schools. And it's just not clear how many Indigenous children from residential schools died after their enrollment. It's not clear how many are missing. There are some numbers that were laid out in the Truth and Reconciliation report, but we don't know the total. We don't know how many were what it's called disappeared. We don't know how many are buried. There's a lot that's unknown. And creating a criminal sanction around this topic will not allow for a thorough investigation to take place. And, you know, I've said the best way to combat misunderstanding of the impact of residential schools are those stories that Murray went and got in her investigation, not by making martyrs out of stupid people who have been charged criminally now with saying stupid things. Another thing that the report says is that Ottawa should regulate search engines and social media companies to immediately remove misinformation or falsehoods about residential schools and unmarked graves or disappeared children. This is not the answer. Like, we don't even know what the falsehoods are at this point because, you know, there's still a lot that is unknown. And, you know, requiring these search engines to remove what we don't know even is false and what is true at this point. Like, there's some things that I think you can say are false, but there's a lot that's still unknown. And if you're forcing search engines to remove things on a dubious and unclear standard, this will create a chilling effect on the exploration of the issue, and overall will interfere with the search of truth, which is really important and what we want to do. If we want broad consensus about the support for Indigenous rights, especially on the right of center, then these types of policies that Murray has proposed, I think, do more harm than good. So we're all actually attending an event tomorrow where Murray is going to be interviewed, put on by the Canadian Club. I mean, I would love to ask her some of these questions. Wouldn't it be nice if I could ask her some of these questions? I
It
mean,
would.
I'm not the one doing the interview, though. How sad. I wish I was, because I really support the work of investigating residential schools and building consensus. And I think it's important to ask questions like these to get there in a productive way. So it would be great if I could have been involved in asking some of these questions, but alas, I'm not. Joanna, what's your bad legal take this week?
So my bad legal take goes to the police of Winnipeg and a Winnipeg business owner who are investigating a potential hate crime after the business owner, whose name is Ramzi Zaid and is Palestinian, noticed some Stars of David written on the pavement on the sidewalk in front of his business, Food Fair, on Portage Avenue. And there's a picture in the CBC article. They look like they were written, looked like they were scrawled by children. There are a few blue chalk Stars of David. Apparently, there was also a single heart included in the chalk on the sidewalk. And the business owner feels that this is a hate crime and says if somebody went and drew a Palestinian flag in front of an Israeli or Jewish-owned store or business, I think it would be investigated as a hate crime. So in my eyes, this is definitely one. Okay, well, first problem with this is that a Star of David is not the Israeli flag. So I don't know what the equivalent would be to a Palestinian flag, but it's certainly, you can't equate those things. The Star of David is much, much, much millennia older. Some people would say even more than that, older than the Israeli flag. By the way, also the two blue stripes on the Israeli flag evoke talit, which are Jewish prayer shawls. So I don't know if you would also claim that somebody who wears a religious Jewish prayer shawl is invoking Zionism and could potentially be investigated for a hate crime. And it made me think about a sort of disturbing interaction that I saw on Twitter last week, which was Peter Beinart, who is an observant anti-Zionist Jewish individual in the US, and he was trying to explain to some of his pro-Palestine audience who are claiming that things like Talit and Stars of David are racist symbols. He was trying to explain to them that they evoke religious symbols. Would you also extend this to menorah, which also is on Israel's national emblem? And he said, if you call Jewish symbols racist because Israel appropriates them, you're no longer just condemning Israel, you're condemning Judaism. Yes, that is rather the point. And by the way, his audience, if you look at the replies, absolutely skewers him for trying to pose some separation between Jewish symbols and Israeli symbols. So back to Winnipeg. No, I don't think that blue chalk on the sidewalk with hearts and some small Stars of David is a hate crime. And so maybe we should all just chill out and go have a smoothie or something. What do you think, Josh? Or sorry, what's your bad legal take?
My bad legal take goes to Greg Asena, the Chief Electoral Officer of Ontario, for something in his new report, which is called Addressing Misinformation and Disinformation Threats to the Electoral Administration in Ontario. And Asena says that there's a threat from misinfo and disinfo targeting Ontario elections, and that the laws need to change to prevent this and punish those who would maliciously attack our elections, either with fake news or AI generated content. And I don't dispute that this risk exists. Russia famously tried this in the US, although they didn't actually target one party, as the Democrats allege. They instead sought to amplify BLM posts and pro-firearms messaging and things that would just cause general division, polarization. And they probably didn't have much effect on the election, but it just is a sort of test case for what can go wrong. So the problem's real, and AI makes it much easier to do something like that on a grand scale because you don't need Eastern Europeans sitting in a basement actually creating the content. But as the Chief Electoral Officer points out, just like with other online harms that we talk about, the big social media companies already have a strong incentive to stop this kind of stuff, and they do so with content moderation on Meta or through content labeling like community notes in the case of X. So it's really not clear whether new laws with big fines attached are required to do this. And where the bad legal take comes in is this. So one of the recommendations the CEO is putting forward is that he should be given new powers to introduce targeted restrictions on content generated by individuals or organizations that spread false or misleading information related to the administration of the electoral process, including voting eligibility requirements, official election dates and times, official processes and procedures for election administration, official voting locations, and official election results. He also wants a duty on platforms to remove non-compliant content within 12 hours, and he wants the power to order individuals or organizations to remove or cease transmitting false or misleading content about the administration of the electoral process, with fines up to $50,000 a day for organizations and $20,000 for individuals. So while I think some of this could be done in a way that respects freedom of expression and protects democracy, for example, restricting false or misleading information about eligibility to vote or what the election date is seems relatively straightforward and worthwhile. But I'm worried about making it illegal to spread false or even just misleading information related to election results. That's a dangerous power to give a civil servant. If this means you can't, you just can't report a number that is not the official result and call that the official result, that may be one thing. But the way it's written makes me think that you won't be allowed to question election results without having your X post or your TikTok videos disappeared from the internet. And that's concerning because elections are never perfect, as we've seen recently in BC, which was generally a very fair and free election. But BC elections has identified a lot of human errors in the count, and they changed the results in small ways. They found an entire, I think it was almost 900 votes sitting in a box that they didn't know about until days after the election. So people need to be able to question this stuff even when they don't have all the facts yet. And if social media companies start disappearing their thoughts related to the election results, it'll only feed into conspiracy theories about stolen elections and prevent people from uncovering fraud that sometimes actually does occur. So, I think the need for some legal changes may be warranted, but we really have to be careful not to chill discussion around the results by going too far here. So that's it. That's the show. As usual, we'll ask you to rate us, review us, and subscribe if you haven't already. And you can support our work by subscribing to the CCF's YouTube channel, by following us on Twitter, or by visiting our website, theccf.ca, where you can for our new and improved Freedom Update newsletter from our colleague Russ. The CCF is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please click that donate button on our website if you can. Thanks for listening.